The topic tonight is on, we're going to cover vacuum stabilization of wood and also casting with resins. And the reason we bring those two things together, one is that there's often a lot of confusion between the two and what you use vacuum for and what you use pressure for. Also that they tend to tie together because there's a lot of applications where if you're casting resin that you want to use the casting against stabilized wood. So that's why it's kind of a natural marriage of the two in order to do this. But that's what we're going to do. So we're going to start with vacuum stabilization. We're going to talk about the equipment, the materials, the economics of doing it, when it applies, when it makes sense, and then we'll move some equipment around, and then we'll go ahead and talk about resins and different kinds of resins and different applications. So
they've already started.
Well,
but before we get into it, it's important to talk about safety with this, because we're now working, in addition to all the hazards normally associated with working with wood, we're now introducing some chemicals, and some pretty nasty chemicals as well. So it's very important that you recognize what you're dealing with. And I'm not going to get into the specifics of each of the chemicals, but know that you, in addition to again, the normal hazards you might have with dealing with wood, that you are going to have to go ahead and prepare for the chemicals. So some of the things you're going to have to worry about are exposure to your skin. The chemical that you use for vacuum stabilization, some people are very allergic to it, and just getting it on their skin will create a severe allergic reaction, and they'll never be able to use it again, kind of like some woods that you're exposed to. But fortunately, it has not been an issue for me. But it is important that you recognize that you need to protect your skin when you're using it against splashes. You need to protect your eyes. Again, just regular eye guards may not help. If you're using chemicals, you really should be, when you're pouring these chemicals, you really should consider using a chemical type eye guard that has full enclosure around your eyes. I will give you just a little personal experience on this. The Cactus Juice, and we'll talk about this later, comes in two parts. It has an activator that you have to add when you buy in the gallon, and you won't be able to see it on here, but this little bottle is actually under pressure, and you can tell that because the foil is domed up. And the very first time I did this, I didn't realize that. I stuck an awl into this, and it actually came out and hit me in the face. And fortunately, I had eye protection on, and it didn't get into my eyes, but it did splash on my face. So even sometimes the most innocuous things can create a hazard. Nitrile gloves are important. These used to be really cheap. Now they're like gold. I think I bought some today, and it was $18 for 100. So every time you use them, it's another 35 cents, but it is important to protect your hands from the chemicals. Other hazards are that when you're working with stabilized wood, it's no longer sawdust that comes out when you turn it and sand it. It's really almost like a talcum powder. It's that fine, and it coats everything. And so it's very important to protect your lungs from this, because again, it's not only this fine powder, which is bad for your lungs, but it also has chemicals in it. So you want to be very careful with that, and make sure you have adequate dust collection. And because it's very, very fine dust, it stays suspended in the air. So even after you finish sanding, if you don't have some kind of air cleaner in your shop, you have to wear that dust protection for a while longer until the air cleans, however you're doing that in your shop.
Hey, Steve.
And then finally, for both.
Steve, can you hear me?
Okay. I can't hear it, so you have to tell me.
Do they recommend a charcoal filter in addition to a dust mask when you're sanding down that stuff to take out any unreacted components?
It's Jeff, and he's asking if they recommend a charcoal filter in addition.
Yes, it's organic, and it depends on whether you're dealing with the epoxies or the Cactus Juice, but I use a charcoal filter when I do it.
And that is in addition to the dust filter, you double up, right?
Yes, and again, I try to do it outside. The part of it that creates vapors with the vacuum stabilization, I like when I heat it to bake it, I do that outside, so it's not in my shop. The actual vacuum process doesn't generate a lot of vapors, and I have a mist filter on my vacuum pump to handle that. But you really have to read the MSDS sheet and that comes with it, and then use the appropriate PPE. I don't want to get in a position where I'm telling you what to do for PPE because I'm not that expert, but just you have to understand it and because it's different for it's different for the polyurethane resins and the polyester resins and the epoxies. They all have different things that you have to consider.
Gentlemen, in it for what it's worth department, if you look at that safety data sheet and don't understand it, call Jeff Danneman. I've been trained over and over and over again, much like Steve. Be glad to give you a hand with it.
Okay, thanks, Jeff.
Jeff's our resident
All right,
chemist, for those who don't know.
The other thing that's important to consider when you're using these both systems is that you're dealing with stored energy. With the vacuum stabilization, you're dealing with a vacuum chamber, and you can say, well, what could happen with that? Well, if there are some, you see on YouTube, some people with some homemade equipment that are using things that aren't meant to hold vacuum, and when this is under full vacuum, there's a lot of force pulling this lid down. If that lid should crack and break and get into the material, it'll create it could actually explode. This is actually a glass lid. It could fracture the lid. It could bounce back and hit you, or create a splash that comes back and creates a problem for you. We're going to talk about pressure pots when we talk about casting the resins. And when my pressure pot's under pressure, there's about 8,000 pounds of pressure pushing that lid off the pressure pot. So we'll talk about some of that more later, but stored energy is definitely a hazard. So not to scare you, but it requires a certain amount of respect and to knowing what you're doing to recognize the hazards and to mitigate it. Any other questions on the safety issues? All right. So what is resin stabilization, vacuum stabilization? It's a process where you create a vacuum, you put a substrate. This is a piece of really punky burl. You create a substrate that you put it under vacuum that draws the air out of the pores of the wood and causes them to be under negative pressure. And with that, once you get the air out of the pores, it's like a sponge. It's submerged in a liquid, and when you release the vacuum, the resin gets sucked into the pores of the wood, and that resin stays liquid until you bake it. In this with a Cactus Juice, it's at 200 degrees, and the resulting product is a very hard, durable finish that allows you to use some otherwise unusable wood. So the products that I, the downside is, other than the fact that you are adding a chemical to your mix, is that it's pricey. a gallon of this material. And it's the material I use is called Cactus Juice. A gallon of this material costs between $70 and $90, depending on what quantity you buy it in. There are a couple places you can get it. I use Cactus Juice, and this is distributed by Turntex. And I'll put something on the website that has a lot of these sources for the materials. But when you buy it by the gallon, it does have to be activated. If you buy smaller quantities of this, it comes already activated. But you have to add this little bottle to the gallon and mix it before you use it. And the advantage is that once Cactus Juice is activated, it cannot be stored in a temperature greater than 85 degrees, or it'll start to go on you. So you don't want to do that. So without it being activated, when you buy the gallon size, it hasn't been activated. And so it doesn't matter if it gets too hot during shipping, particularly during the summer months and stuff. So, but once you activate it, even in your own shop, if you're in an unair conditioned space, you're going to want to keep that in the house or someplace where it's not going to get over 85 degrees, or it will go bad. So, but that's the material that I use, and it goes into a vacuum chamber, and there's two up here on the bench. This one is one that will hold a 12-inch diameter piece, about 6 inches thick. And here's one that will hold things like peppermill blanks and those types of things. So either one of these works. The pot one, you can buy them from Turntex, but I had good luck with a company called Best Value Vacs that has that has these. And I actually have three. I have these two, and I have one more that's 16 inches in diameter that allows some bigger pieces in it. So the equipment, in addition to the vacuum chamber, you need a vacuum pump. And I don't use the vacuum pump I use for my vacuum chuck, just because this stuff gets into the system, and I don't want to pollute my other system with it. So this is just a cheap Harbor Freight vacuum pump that's used for HVAC applications. And what's important with the vacuum pump for this application is you don't need to move a lot of air. But what's more important is you need to be able to get to 27, whatever the theoretical maximum is for your altitude for your maximum vacuum. Around here, it's about 27.5 inches of mercury. But you want to be able to pull that full vacuum. It doesn't have to pull, again, doesn't have to pull a lot of volume like your vacuum chuck may need to do on a piece of porous wood, but it does need to pull a high vacuum, and the HVAC pumps are set up to do that. So again, this is a cheap Harbor Freight, and as a matter of fact, this is fairly new because the one I was using for several years before this one finally stopped working a few days ago. And but typically you have to change the oil. What's the other good thing about these is you can change the oil on them. And before I use this on resin, I will put a pre-filter on it, so and a mist filter on the exhaust, and so you're not getting mist in the air when you do it. So anyway, so you need a pump. And you need an oven. Whatever you do, do not use the oven in your house. This is nasty stuff. First of all, you don't want to do it in the house. I went to a thrift store and found a used toaster oven that could hold a 16-inch round pizza in it. It's a fairly good sized toaster oven. And I've been using that ever since. It's dirty and cranky, and but it continues to work, and it's nice because it'll hold the maximum size piece that I can put in a vacuum chamber.
Hey, Steve, can you make your screen
The
big?
problem with any toaster oven is you want to be
There's a question, he wants to have the screen bigger.
okay.
you in there.
Well, you don't need to get me in there. You probably just get what we're talking about. I think it's probably more important.
I mean, I don't know about everybody else, but I'm looking at a 2x1 inch square, not my whole screen.
You need to change your view from gallery to,
Is that better? Whoever asked the question, trying to get.
Or full screen, or get a PC or a laptop.
Yeah, I'm saying full screen.
I'm seeing a full
Yeah.
screen too.
Yeah, my
Thank
screen
you.
shows
What?
is
You're
check
probably
mark.
a
Seeing
local
a full
setting.
screen, Jeff's not, I
Yeah.
guess.
Oh, everyone should be seeing a full screen.
Yeah, you should be set to speaker, not gallery or full.
Excuse me, gentlemen, it was my stupidity. I'm fixed. Thank you.
Okay. All right.
Okay, resume back.
Zoom support
Okay.
closed.
All right.
He's
This-
a chemist.
the,
What can we
Cactus Juice
say?
is set at temperatures between 190 and 200 degrees. You
Absolutely.
have to get to that temperature, but if you just can't set it too high, or it'll all evaporate out before it sets in your wood. So it's very important that you maintain temperature control. The temperature controls on most toaster ovens are not anywhere near accurate. So I found it very beneficial to have one of these little. This was a $35 temperature probe that this was made by a company called Therm Pro. But what's nice about this is I put the probe, and what I do is I just wrap the probe in foil and stick it on top of the piece of wood or the wood samples that I have in there. And then this has a digital readout on this, but it also has a remote display. So I can bring this piece, the remote, back into my shop, and I can set it for a temperature. So I have it set for 210 degrees. And if the oven should go above 210, it alarms and tells me that. And I can go out and make the adjustment outside. Because if it gets too hot, like I said, it just evaporates all the resin out of the wood before it has a chance to set in there. And then now you have an expensive puddle underneath in the bottom of your oven. So there are some people on the internet that wrap their pieces in aluminum foil before they put them in the oven. I have found that does not help retain the resin into the wood, and it makes it a terrible mess to try to clean up that, because the foil's all stuck to the blanks. You end up having to sand it off. And so I just put it on. I lined the bottom shelf of my oven with foil. I put a shelf above it where I put the wood, and so the drippings don't go into the element in the oven. And then I do it that way. So my blank is sitting on the rack rather than rather than wrapped in foil. I just see no need at all to wrap stuff in foil. It's just very difficult to get it apart. So anyway, so that's what I use for temperature control. Right. And then finally, the wood has to be dry before you put it in the vacuum chamber. If you don't do that, you're trying to displace water, and it contaminates your resin, and it doesn't work nearly as well. So what I do is I'll take my blanks and just throw them. I don't worry about checking moisture in it. If it's air dried, you don't do it at all in green wood. But if it's air dried wood, I put it in the oven at 250 degrees for 12 hours, and I find that I certainly let it cool then before you put it in your vacuum chamber, and then that's usually, I've found that to be dry enough for anything we need to do. And again, I'm not doing big pieces.
Bob and Steve, we have a question.
If you do have a bowl blank, a piece that's a large piece of burl, or okay.
Does the wood
I
stick
can't
to
hear
the rack in the oven?
Does the wood stick to the rack in the oven?
Sometimes, but not normally, because the stuff drips down to the foil below it, so on the shelf below it. So it's just, sometimes you just need to knock it off, but it typically is not a problem. I haven't had anywhere I couldn't get it off. Any questions?
Nope, that was it.
So you need to start out with it dry. I was talking about if you do have a bowl blank, the first time I did this, I had this nice 12-inch bowl blank, about 4 inches thick, really nice spalted wood. And I put it in there and I realized it used a half a gallon of resin for this piece of wood, and that's $40 worth of resin. And then I ended up turning out the inside of the bowl and turned $20 of that resin away. So if you aren't going to core the piece, rough out your blank first, and then then cast it, then put it in the vacuum chamber and stabilize it. But it is not economical at all, unless you have such an incredible piece of wood, to go ahead and to stabilize just whole bowl blanks. It just doesn't make sense to do that. We'll talk about later that some of the work I've done with burl and some of the hybrid pieces that I've, but you get 4 cores out of it, and then that makes it much more economical to do it. But it has to be a pretty nice piece of wood in order to justify the stabilization process. Just a quick example. The other thing you can do, you can put dye in the resin when you do it. I use Alumalite dyes that are these little bottles of dye that you get from Illuminate, and you just put that in there. This jug, this is just some of the dyed product and so when I'm doing a dyed piece, I just use the colored stuff. What's nice is that when you're done, what's left in the pot is still good to use, and it keeps for a very long time. So it's not like where an epoxy or something like that, what's left over is gone. It sets. This stuff, if it hasn't been baked, it stays good for a long time. But just to give you an idea of some of the differences between a dyed piece, here's 2 pieces. Hold these better. I'll try to reduce some glare. So this piece is a piece of burl. It's a burl slice. I'm making charcuterie boards, and that's been stabilized without the dye, and then this piece has been stabilized with the dye. I don't know whether you want to zoom in on those or whether you can see them any better. But yeah, if you can just see, and it really does make the grain pop. There's no finish on these boards. All right, they've just been sanded, and I just put them on the wax wheel to buff them, just to give them a little bit of protection from fingerprints. But there's no finish necessary because the finish is actually impregnated into the wood. All right. So depending upon the piece you're using, so in this pot, there's actually I just leave. When I use this pot most often, and I just leave the resin in there. I put the lid on it, and it'll stay for months. And so when I need to add more, I add more. I do have a couple of brass rods sitting in the bottom of this to just pick the pieces up off the bottom, so you tend to get better distribution of the vacuum inside. And I just have a variety of steel weights that I put in there on top of the wood, just to keep it from floating when you do it. And you want to make sure that the resin covers whatever wood you're using. You need an inch or so of liquid above the highest point, because at some point when you release the vacuum, all that liquid is going into the pores of the wood, and the volume level will go down in the resin level will go down. And if you don't have enough covering the wood, you'll have parts of it that aren't getting impregnated. A lot of discussion about how much time to do this. I'm going to show you a demonstration here in a minute about what it looks like when you turn one of these on and it starts sucking the air out of it. But what I have found is that I err on the side of you can't keep it in there too long. But if you don't keep it in there long enough, you don't get full penetration of the resin. So it depends on the piece. Some of the bigger burl pieces I'm in there, I'll have it under vacuum for several days.
I have a question.
What I found is, and
Got a question.
yeah,
Can you start and stop the process if, say, example, you discover that you didn't have enough resin to cover it?
Can you start and stop the process if you were to discover you didn't have enough material to cover it?
yeah. So if you find that as it starts coming down, and so I'll watch it. If it looks like I'm getting close to it, so at the point that you've released all the vacuum, you can take the lid off. So if you've released the vacuum and take the lid off and you see it starting to go down and you think you may not have enough, before any wood's exposed, you can add more resin to it. If you leave it and you come back and you got a half an inch of wood exposed, that's been exposed, you just have to add more resin and put it under vacuum again to get it out of there, to get the air out. But you do have an option. You do have some freedom right when you release the vacuum to watch it. You can take the lid off, and if it looks like it's going down, if it looks like it may not make it, then just add some more to it.
Is this a two-part thing where you draw vacuum on the wood, then put the resin in?
Jeffrey was asking, is it a two-part process where you draw the vacuum down and then put material in?
The material is submerged while you're drawing the vacuum. So it bubbles up. You can see bubbles forming as you apply the vacuum. So it's submerged, and then you release the vacuum while it's submerged, and the material gets drawn into it. So the pores are put under negative pressure. There's negative pressure in the pores of the wood. You're sucking the air out of the pores of the wood, but no resin's going into those pores until you release the vacuum. It's like just releasing a sponge. So if you were to squeeze a sponge and stick it in a bucket and release it, that's what happens when you release the vacuum. It pulls the water into the pores. Does that answer the question?
Yeah, that's
Okay. All right. So that's the process. So you release the pressure. So I added a valve onto my pot here. It didn't come with this valve. So the vacuum's coming in this side. Focused on there. Okay. So the vacuum comes in here. I have a quick connect that goes to the vacuum pump. And just a word of caution that most quick connects, or some quick connects, don't work with vacuum. There are special quick connects that are designed for vacuum. I happen to be lucky enough that my old company was getting rid of a bunch of stuff that they use vacuum pumps a lot, and I had some access to. They were getting rid of all these quick connects. Otherwise, I wouldn't use quick connects. I would just thread the fittings on. But a normal compressor quick connect is meant to work under pressure, not under vacuum. So they'll still connect, and while they're connected, they work. They just don't seal it. But I put a valve on the upstream side of this, so there's really no need to run your pump the entire time. So I'll watch this. I'll get this up to on this gauge. It'll be up to the point where it's almost up to full vacuum. It's got a glass top there. I can see what's happening, and the air bubbles are coming out of it. But once it reaches up to almost full vacuum, I turn off the pump. I turn off this valve to seal the pot, and I turn off the pump. There's no need to run that pump continuously. And then it'll start to bleed down as some of the air comes out of the wood. And then you turn the pump on again. But I don't run my pump when I'm doing these multi-day vacuums. I don't run it at night. I don't run it typically when I'm not anywhere near the shop, because a pump could burn up on you, or lots of things could happen. So
What is full vacuum?
so that just saves your pump by not running it, for 3 days straight. So, in the evening, I'll come down, I'll seal this off, I'll turn off the pump. And if it's a big piece that's going to require multiple days, I'll just come back the next morning and turn the pump on again, open the valve, turn it up, bring it back down, turn the pump off again. And so it just depends. And a piece like this might take 2 or 3 hours till the till the bubbles stop coming out of it. And that's when you know you've achieved where you want to be, is there's no more air in the pores, there's no more bubbles coming out of it.
The question was, what is full vacuum?
So
Oh, question is, what is full vacuum?
here it's about 27.5 inches of mercury, 27.5, 28, somewhere in that range. I don't remember the exact number, but that's your maximum theoretical. That's 1 bar, but it varies a little bit based on elevation. But we are not that far above sea level here, so it's about 27.5, 28, somewhere in that range. And that's most vacuum pumps, that's all they're going to pull, unless you get a really, really high dollar pump that may pull a little bit more. But about 95% of theoretical is about what most of these pumps will pull. So now we've got to the point where we've gotten all the air out of the pores of the wood. It's all the pores under negative pressure. And we slowly release the vacuum. You don't want to do it too fast, or it'll cause a lot of splashes inside your tank. You open this valve, you open your venting valve here, you release your vacuum, and you can just watch the fluid level in your tank go down as the material gets sucked into the pores of the wood. Now, there's a lot of people say, well, you should, how long do you leave it in there? And it's a law of diminishing returns. So, but I tend to, again, if I'm not in a hurry, I'll just leave it in there for a couple of days. I don't worry about it. The rule of thumb for smaller pieces is you leave it in there for twice as long as it took you to achieve the vacuum. I don't worry about it. Again, I'm usually not in a hurry, and sometimes it's in there for a week. And I just, but if you're in a hurry, you can use the twice as long as it took you to get all the bubbles to stop coming out. I will say one other word of caution: when you're applying the vacuum, depending upon, and you'll see here that the material will tend to foam up, and you don't want it depending. So the port on this pot is sitting right at this level here, right where the gauge is. You don't want to be sucking resin into your vacuum pump. So you may have to adjust your vacuum with this vent to keep it from getting too much vacuum too fast, and to keep that foam down. And it only takes a few minutes. Once you get the bulk of the air out, and again, I'll show you on this clear one here what that looks like. But you want to just make sure you're watching it when you're first applying that vacuum, to make sure that you're not sucking the resin into your vacuum pump. I do have a filter on both inlet and outlet side of my pumps. It's a trap that if I do end up sucking something in, it'll get caught in the filter before it goes into the pump. So, any questions on this? So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to show you, I have water in this tank, and you can just zoom right into that, Bob. So rather, because you just bring it down a little bit, or maybe have to zoom out just a little bit so you get the whole thing. Okay, that'll work. So this actually came from Turntex. They sell this. You'll see it's got a gauge, it's got an inlet, a quick connect for the inlet, and then it's got a vent on the top here. This is water in here, not cactus juice, mainly because I'm not going to do anything, but also from a safety standpoint tonight. And that's just additional water. So I'm going to stick these 2 pieces of wood in here. And I just have to do one of them. I'm just going to do one of them because it's a little too much. And I just have a weight that I put in there just to hold it underwater. And put my lid on. And there's just a rubber seal on the bottom of this that gets held on with vacuum. I'm going to start it with this vent open. All right, and as I close this vent, see, and I have that fluid is very close to the top. But it'll start drawing vacuum. Maybe. And that foaming's with water in there. If that was cactus juice in there, it would foam up even more. So let's just zoom right into that. That's kind of hard to see the bubbles, but anyway, it's pulling. All it's doing is just pulling that out. So that would essentially sit there, and you'll see this needle will eventually peg out on the top, but it'll just continue to pull that and until there's no more bubbles coming out of it. And again, a piece that with 2 by 2 by 6, that'd be it'd probably be in there 2 or 3 hours until all the bubbles stop coming out of it. But you can see right now it's still pulling enough air out of there that it hasn't reached anywhere near the theoretical vacuum yet on there. So that's the process for vacuum stabilization. And then when you're done, you would just release it, and and then the water level gets sucked into the piece. All right, any questions on that before we leave the vacuum stabilization? All right, if you can just give me a minute here and let me switch some of this equipment out of the way.
So I've got a quick question. Would you use tongs to get the piece out? Because I'm sure it's dripping.
Your question
is, would you use tongs to get it out of the cylinder? How do you always take it out?
So it depends. So when I'm working with the pot, I just use rubber gloves and go in there and get it. If I'm working in the cylinder, typically I'll just pour, because I don't store anything. I don't store the cactus juice in the cylinder. I'll pour it out carefully into the back. I have a funnel, a big funnel. I stick in the jug, and I'll take this, put it in the jug. I'll pour it out from the cylinder back into the jug, and then just reach in with my rubber gloves and get the piece out. Tongs don't. The wood is very heavy. It's 2 to 3 times heavier after it's been stabilized, depending upon the wood, than when you put it in. So yeah, I typically just use gloves.
Have you ever, or is there even a reason to stabilize wood that hasn't gone too far, say just a little bit punky? Is there a benefit?
The question is there ever a reason to stabilize wood that's not totally punky, but just to get in that direction? Going that direction?
Sure. So there's a lot of times where just you'll have a bow blank that just has a small piece of it that's punky, or there's been times where I've roughed out a bowl. I've let it out of green wood. I let it dry. It's all dry. I've tried to go to finish it, and I'm just getting, I can just tell there may be some sapwood that's just not that's cooperating. It's just a lot of tear out, or rather than using CA, I'll go ahead and stabilize it. And the thing is, the resin's only going where the soft wood is. If you have hard, dense wood, it's going to be really difficult to get the resin in there. So, but yeah, I have done stuff, and a lot of people use it again as a dye. So if you want a dye that goes completely through a piece, and you can even use, there's people that do double dyeing where they'll dye it in one color and then they'll put part of it, they'll just suspend it in the vacuum chamber and just do part of it before they bake it. They'll go ahead and just put part of it in a different color dye and double dye it. And you don't have to use the full vacuum chamber. You can actually take a cup like this and stick it down in there. So if you're going to double dye something, you could put a little bit of cactus juice, just put it in the bottom. If you had a piece that long, you could just put it in there, set it in the bottom of it, stick this in the vacuum chamber. So you don't need a whole lot of dyed resin to do it, and then just run it. And so again, you can put a smaller container in the big container, so you get more efficiency in your product. Any questions? Spill my water here.
I think we're good.
All right, so let's talk about resin and casting resins now. So I think most people are familiar with casting resins and why you would do it. You do them to create a blank or to create a hybrid, or some people just turn just totally resin pieces. So there's two parts of this. You can use it to create a blank, and you can use it to fix defects in wood, or you can use it to fix cracks, or you can actually use it for enhancements of certain pieces. All right. Let's just switch to camera 2. Yeah, give us 1 second here. We're just going to change batteries on the camera here.
While they're doing that, one thing Steve's done a lot of that hasn't mentioned here is he uses a router on the piece to carve inlay, fills it with resin. So that's an artful way of making use of resin in the wood. Cut your pattern to a certain depth that you know you're going to cut through, fill the resin, let it harden, turn the piece complete.
It must not be charged. There we go. I'll go ahead and put this one in the charger. He's going to
In the past, I've used the CNC machine at State to cut some rather intricate patterns that I filled with resin later. Did that while the blank was still square, so it could be mounted and held down safely on the CNC machine.
go back, switch to camera 1.
Gene, it's
All right,
not
sorry
your
about
video.
that.
There was nothing showing at the moment.
My head's not in the picture.
Picky. Boy, once these guys get
That's all
an
I'm saying.
ego.
I can hear him.
Gotta have the star of the show in there.
Of course.
All right. So you can cast lots of different things. I tend to cast burl. The primary thing I do is I usually cast burl into resin of some sort. These are bottle opener handles and just various things that it allows me to use some smaller pieces and incorporate the and I'll show you some of the they're called hybrid pieces when they have both wood and resin in them. So So they, there's different types of resin for different applications. And what used to be one of the more common ones was polyester resin. Got a problem? It's working. So polyester resin inlace, a number of people have used inlace. Inlace is a polyester resin. And you know, it's typically a polyester resin when you have just a very small bottle of activator. You know, you activate with drops rather than large volumes. So you know, but polyester resin, first of all, it's expensive. And it is lower cost than some of the other ones, but it's very, very noxious. You should not use it indoors. You need really good respiratory protection on it. And it's really not very common now. It's used to fill small things, but it's not really used for large scale casting like we're going to talk about tonight.
Well, Steve, when you
so
talk respiratory
then we get
protection
into-
there, that's a charcoal filter, right?
This is Jeffrey asking about whether you use charcoal filters on these too.
At times I do. I tend to do it in a well ventilated area. So, but if I'm in a closed shop, I do.
The point here, Steve, if I may, when we talk respiratory protection, most of us are thinking about dust. With this kind of stuff, we're talking organic vapor, and we switch to a charcoal filter.
A new one, not one you had under your workbench from last year.
We talk dust control, we're talking basically wood, but this is different because you're using.
Right. There's vapors involved.
Yes.
He done talking. All right. So once you get past the polyester resin, there's really two types of resins that are out there. And then there's subsets of these. There's polyurethane resin. So Illuminate is one of the brands that I use most often and had very good success with it. But Illuminate makes a polyurethane resin. It's called it's either Illuminate Clear or Illuminate Clear Slow. And the only difference between these two is one has 5 minutes of working time, the other one has 12 minutes of working time. The advantage of polyurethane is it sets very quickly. So either between 5 and 12 minutes, depending upon which one you're using. It has very low odor. It can be dyed easily. And but because it sets so quickly, it requires a pressure pot in order to make it clear. So I don't know how well you can see that. Maybe I'll just zoom into this piece. But if you can, if you look at this piece, and this has no polish, this is right out of the mold, but it is, they call it optically clear. If you were to polish this piece, there's no air bubbles in it. It is clear. So that's the advantage of casting under pressure. So, but the polyurethane, because it does set so quickly, you have to use a pressure pot in order to get the air bubbles out. And it doesn't get the air bubbles out. What it does is the pressure pot makes them microscopic, so you can't see them. But what's nice is that I could cast a bottle opener blank in the morning and turn it that afternoon. I mean, it sets it's got, even if I use the slow, it's got 12 minutes of open time, and it within 2 hours you can demold it and turn it. So very quickly you can use it. The problem is that because it's set so quickly, it generates a lot of heat. It's an exothermic reaction, and we're going to talk when we show some of the pieces later. You'll see that because of that, you really can't pour it very thick. It's not a problem when you have something this thin, but if you had a large piece that you're pouring more than an inch thick, it's very prone to cracking, to have a thermal crack get into it because of the heat that's generated. The way you mitigate heat generation is you have it cured very, very slowly. And so you have to go from the polyurethane resins now to the epoxy resins. So there are a number of epoxy resins out there for different applications. Illuminate just recently came out with this Alumalite deep pour, and I'm going to show you a piece that I used this on the first time I've used it very successfully. They say 2 to 3 inches max. Mine was almost 4.5 to 5 inches thick. So, and I didn't have any trouble with it. One of the advantages I have is I have an air conditioned shop, and I actually lowered the temperature in the shop to account for some of that. I also cast it under pressure. You don't need to use a pressure pot because it sets so slowly. You can use either other means to get the air bubbles out, but because it fit in the pressure pot, I used it. It was still tacky at 48 hours. So in the pot that I mixed it up in, I just kept checking it, and it took over 2 days for it to set up to the point where I'd even consider it set, but it was probably 5 days before it was fully cured. And that's about what they say, is that give it a week before you turn it. So there are other epoxies that you can use. That I used an epoxy called Liquid Diamond that is somewhere between this and this. It's set in about a day, and you could turn it after 2 days. Again, you have to be careful where the thickness goes. But the advantage is that if you have something that sets in hours rather than minutes, you can use either a torch or a heat gun on your piece to bring the bubbles up to the surface and to get. You see the guys that are casting these big river tables. That's what they're doing. They're using these really slow set epoxies, and they're using a torch or a heat gun over the entire surface multiple times in order to bring the bubbles to the surface. And that's the way to get rid of the bubbles. So these are the three. And this third one here is something that I just got that I haven't used yet. But I showed you I was making charcuterie boards that I've stabilized. I have some bigger ones that I want to make that are bigger than the 16-inch pressure pot. I want to infuse them with something that will keep them from staining and make them very durable when exposed to, fruit and wood or fruit and cheese and those types of things. We don't want them to stain. And this is a penetrating epoxy made by Total Boat that they use for impregnating rotten wood on boats. And it's water thin, and it sets very slowly, so it has time to actually get down into the wood. So it doesn't build any surface on the wood. It gets down into the pores, and then eventually it sets with a chemical reaction. I have not used that yet. I've seen other people use it with some success. So I'll let you know how that works. But it's also an epoxy, but it's just a very, very low viscosity. The polyester resins, polyurethane resins are mixed 1-to-1 by weight. So you mix these with a scale, and you just weigh them out, and you put equal parts A and B, and then you mix them. And what I do is I mix them in 2 different cups and then pour them together in order to because your working time is so short. The epoxies typically are two parts and 1 part, and some of them are 2-to-1 by volume. Some of them are 2-to-1 by weight. I tend to convert everything by weight because it's a lot easier to measure accurately by weight than by volume. If you look at the markings on a mixing cup, I mean, you could easily get something wrong on here. And so I have, for the different products that I use, I know what the unit weights are for each part, and I just go ahead and mix them up by weight rather than rather than by volume. I find that works much better. So mixing is very, very important. I will show you a piece a little later, a picture of a piece that what happens when you don't mix it sufficiently. It either doesn't set and you end up with soft spots in it, or it gets wavy inside the piece. You can see it's not homogeneous inside the piece. So and so it's very important that you mix it, and particularly if you're mixing large volumes. Again, that's if you're doing a large pour, it's a real advantage of using an epoxy that sets in hours rather than minutes. When you only have 5 to 10 minutes of open time, and that means you have to have it under pressure within those 12 minutes. So that's not, even the slow is 12 minutes. It's not a lot of time to make this work. So if you're going to do a large pour, you don't want to use the polyurethane resins. I use a variety of mixing pots and mixing methods. When the big pour that I just recently did, I poured a gallon of it, and I used these very large, these 4-liter buckets. And for that, because it was epoxy, and I actually had the ability to cast it in the pressure pot. I have these. It's just a mixer. It's a glue mixer that you can use, and you just put it in the drill, and it mixes it up very well. For smaller pours, you can use a variety of stir sticks. I just take these are tongue depressors, and I just put them on the belt sander and get a nice flat end on them, and I do 100 of them at a time and stick them in my bin. You can use paint sticks or very often I'll use just rubber spatulas. And the advantage of this is you can actually scrape the sides of your bucket. Even when I use other means, I typically just take the rubber spatula and clear the sides of the mixing pot. You'll find that once you start casting resin, that you're always on the lookout for various containers that either to use as molds or mixing things. This is a bucket that birdseed came in, and it's actually a great size for making as a mold for making parts.
Terry
We'll
Brown,
find that
Terry Seuss is asking
after you
about
use one of these,
resins yellowing and browning.
Terry Brown's asking about resins yellowing.
Terry
and
Seuss,
browning.
sorry.
Oh, Terry Seuss.
so I have not had a problem with the newer resins doing that. The Illuminate, both the polyurethane and I haven't cast very many that are absolutely clear though. What I have found is that the colors fade with ultraviolet light. I've had some pieces, and so where I've had very subtle coloring in the pieces, the color has faded some, but it hasn't yellowed. It just became almost clear rather than yellowing. And I think so. What you want is you want a casting resin. The resins that are used for boat building and gluing furniture and stuff, they start out almost with a little bit of yellowing in them. But the ones that are meant for this type of work are pretty clear and are pretty stable. I have found that I have pieces that are 3 years old that have been cast that have no signs of yellowing at this point.
Is that true for the epoxies though?
Is that true for the epoxies?
I don't have as long of an experience with the epoxies, but I have pieces that are 2 years old that are epoxy that have not yellowed. So with any plastic, you want to keep it out of direct sunlight because essentially what you have is a plastic when you're done.
Jeff, I agree with Jeff's comment. Epoxies are have been known to have this problem for a long time.
Just saying that the epoxies have been on a long time. Yellowing. Jeff made that comment.
Yeah, I think there's been some developments, but I don't know for sure. I can't. But I usually put some coloring in them. I seldom cast anything that's just perfectly clear. So you'll find that if you, these things cost a couple dollars each. You don't want to be throwing them out after each pour. They're almost impossible to clean. But if you just let whatever resin you're using set in it, you can actually just squeeze these things together and typically get either pulled off the sides or pull it out of the bottom, and you just keep using these things over and over. Don't wipe them out when you're done using them, because if you get a really thin film on there, you can't get it out. But if you just tend to do it. So that's the mixing. They're easily dyed. There's a variety of dyes you can use. There's lots of companies making dyes from a lot of different places. Again, I tend to, and most of these dyes are interchangeable. I tend to go with mostly on the liquid dyes, Alumalite dyes, and I use them for both the polyurethane and the epoxy resins. A little bit, this dye is very, very concentrated. I'll leave it down here so you can just zoom into these. For a 6 or 8 ounce pour, one little drop on the end of a toothpick is all that's required to dye to get a pretty deep color like this. This probably had 1 or 2 drops on the end of a toothpick in order to achieve that color, that deep color in there. So you don't need much. If you use too much, if you're looking for something that's opaque, that's totally colored, then you can use more. The other thing that you can do is you can put these pearl powders in, and these are typically mica powders. Illuminate makes them, and other companies make them as well. This company is made by Pearl X, but these give you the pearlescent effect. You can kind of see it a little bit in this piece, but I'll show you it better on some other pieces. You can see it in the top of this piece. It's that sparkly effect in there. And then I have not used these yet. These are Illuminate polycolors. These are powdered dyes and some are metallic, some are pearl. But I find the pearlescence makes a really nice effect in the pieces, and it also tends to hide some defects if you have to repair something. With
Question about
the
powder stack to the
polyurethane
bottom.
resins, the way I do this is I will pull.
Norm had a question, but I didn't hear it. Norm, can you hear me?
Yes, Bruce Ramey asks if you have trouble with the powder or glitter setting to the bottom.
I've not had that problem. Glitter. So glitter is different than the pearl powders. The pearl powders are so fine that they will typically stay suspended. And I'll show you the bowl that I did that took 48 hours to set. The pearl powder stayed suspended in that. Glitter is heavier, and some glitter will actually settle out, but some glitter is actually lighter than the material that you put, the stuff that's made out of mylar. The mylar is lighter than the liquid, so it'll stay suspended. But glitters, you have to be careful with glitters, because not if it's metallic glitter, it will settle out. With the polyurethane resins, because they set quickly, the way I do is I will mix up the entire batch in one bucket, and I'll pour a little bit off. I'll pour a little bit off into a separate cup, and then I will let that, I'll dye the parent bucket and pour that into the mold. And then I've learned from experience that when this material, when I have it in the mold and it reaches 95 degrees, that it's about to flash. I have about a minute to get this thing done, but it also gets more viscous at that point. So I'll take what's in the second cup that has a pearl powder mixed in with it, and just pour it over the mold and maybe stir it in a little bit, maybe not, and then button it up under pressure. And again, I have about a minute to do that, pouring, get the lid on the pressure pot and get it under pressure. And I'll show you some pictures of some finished pieces that have a very swirly pearl effect in them. That's how I achieve that. But the way I do that is this is just an infrared temperature sensor, and you press on it and point it at something, and you can just watch it, and you can just watch the temperature go up. I'm going to shop 70 degrees to start with, and it gradually climbs, and I've just learned from experience that 95 is the magic number to make that work. As far as molds go, some of this stuff out of the way here.
Steve, if you use a alcohol-based dye with the exothermic resin, would the dye start trying to evaporate inside the resin and create voids or anything of that nature?
I have not had that. I've not had. It's a thermal reaction that's due to heat shrinkage when it gets very hot and then it shrinks as it cools, and that's what causes the cracking. I haven't had any that have pulled out of. I mean, if there's a void inside something, actually, and I forgot to mention, it is absolutely essential that if you're casting resins, that the wood has to be dry, has to be very, very dry. So that's one of the reasons I tend to stabilize anything that any wood that I'm going to cast resin against, I stabilize first, because I know it's dry. There's no moisture in there because all that moisture has been displaced. But if you, particularly with the polyurethane resins, not so much with epoxy, but with the polyurethane resins, if you have any moisture at all, you'll get a white foam on the surface of what you're doing. And it takes just a little bit of moisture. You do it on a humid day, it can be dry. So it's very important that everything be very dry. That's one of the downfalls. Epoxy is not as critical, but it still will. You still get some, if there's moisture in it and you get heat, the moisture gets drawn up through the wood. And so having a stabilized, it's one of the reasons I stabilize everything I do that I'm casting resins against.
Thank you.
All right. If I'm doing my larger hybrid blanks, I tend to use, these are Hdpe cutting boards. You buy them by the package. They're usually 24 by 30 or something from Amazon, and you can make a variety of different sizes. I just cut them into circles, and I use, this is also Hdpe, and the beauty of Hdpe is that most of these resins don't like to stick to it. So I just take this, all I do is I just hot melt glue this this thin flexible Hdpe to the edges of this, and I have them in different sizes. And if it's a 6-inch pour, I'll use a 6-inch piece. But I just hot melt glue it to the edge of this, and then I just to make sure it seals, I just put tape along that bottom edge too. And I just tape it. And I'll show you that process here in a slideshow in a minute. But that's when I'm doing the bigger pours. That's what I do. One of the things that I have found really helpful, and it's going to be hard for you to see it, but there's actually a little hole right in the middle of this this base. And when I cast this, resin goes into that hole and it gives me a little nub. And so I know where the center of my blank is. And it makes it very easy to put my glue block on. So, that there's just an advantage of doing it that way. I found that by accident. I put that in there actually to put it on my circle jig, but having that little nub on there makes it very easy to center it when I'm done. So that's how I cast the bigger blanks. These smaller blanks, like these the bottle opener blanks, I use PVC pipe, and these are tailstock pieces for drains, and they're just a little over an inch in diameter. But what's nice is they have this nice flange on the bottom there. And all I do with these is I take them and I just hot melt glue them onto a piece of Hdpe base, and I'll glue 3 or 4 of these down and put them on there. And so I use this for my bottle opener blanks. For also have it I just keep a variety of these other pieces if I'm doing something bigger, just thin wall PVC. And again, I just use hot melt glue on them. There's some people that use silicone caulk and other things, but the beauty of hot melt glue is it sets up very quickly. The other thing I do is I keep my hot melt glue gun handy as I pour the resin in. So if I have a problem, I can fix it. But that's I just used, again, just various pieces of PVC pipe, and I use them until they get too wonky, and then I throw them out and just cut some more pieces.
Does the heat
One thing
generated
that's
by
really
the
important
chemical-
to do.
Does the heat generated by the chemical reaction ever melt the hot glue on you?
Does the heat created by the chemical reaction ever melt the hot glue?
Haven't had a problem with that. But on the bigger pours, which are done in these, I always have tape. I always put tape along the bottom anyway. So I don't, this is mold release. It's a company called Stoner. Anytime I'm casting in a round mold like these, I use this mold release, and the pieces just slide right out. When I'm doing these bigger pieces, where I have the thin material on the sides, I just peel this stuff off. I don't have to worry about it. But you see some of the YouTube people doing this, and they don't use mold release, and they're beating these things out of here, or they're using the bottom of a 5-gallon bucket for a mold, and they're just having a really hard time getting it out. But this mold release, it's like magic. You just put it on there and it slides right out. The downside is you can't spray that until after you hot melt glue it, because the hot melt glue won't stick to it either. So if you were to put that, if it's on your base, so before I hot melt glue anything down to one of my bases, I just wipe it down with denatured alcohol and go from there and glue it on. So let's see if I got, let me just show you the pressure pot real quick. So this one is a paint pot that you can now actually buy these that are set up by the same company, that were not converted from being a paint pot, but this was actually for spray painting. And there's what used to be an auger here in the middle that I took out and just put this heavy bolt and washer in there instead. And that's the major modification I made. So it's got a pressure gauge, it's got a regulator for the pressure going into it, and then it's got a relief. It has a safety valve on it that's set. This particular pressure pot is rated for 90 psi. I have the safety valve set for 80 psi. So if it hits 80 psi, if the regulator gets screwed up and it hits 80 psi, that this safety valve will pop off. And then I just have a valve for releasing the pressure after when I'm ready to take the piece out. It's got a hefty lid on it with four strong wig nuts that do not rely on, a bolt pressing down on the point of the lid. If you look at the Harbor Freight pot It's not nearly as beefy as this. And I think the Harbor Freight pots are rated at 60 PSI. You probably only need 50 PSI in order to get the air bubbles out. I run mine at 75, but I have a regulator here that's set for 75 PSI. I hook it up, and once it's under pressure, if I'm doing the epoxies that take days to set, I leave my air line connected to it. If I'm doing the polyurethane that takes an hour to set, once I get it up to pressure, I disconnect my air. I just turn it off and take my airline off it. So, but again, you have to be careful with this. It is under pressure, and like I said, there's about 8,000 pounds trying to lift that lid off there when this is at 75 PSI. So the other thing I have done is I put a donut in the bottom of it, and you can tell I have had some stuff leak. But what this does is it allows me to get, if something does leak, I can get it. It's not glued to the bottom of the pot. So it doesn't stick. The resin doesn't stick to this very well. This is just a piece of composite decking. And the hole in the middle is there occasionally will cast something that has a chuck attached to it that allows me to put the chuck in the bottom of it as if I'm holding something in a chuck. So, but I just set that in the bottom, and it just allows me to make sure I can get the pieces out when I'm done. Let me just talk about finishing here. So we're probably not going to get to the lathe tonight, but so to finish the resins, let me just talk about cutting the resins. Run out of room here. So my go-to tool for working on the resin pieces is a negative rake scraper with a 50-degree occluded angle. And this one was about twice as long when I started doing this work, but it's got a slight curve on it that I put on it that allows me to get inside of bowls. But this, and realize that if you're doing a composite piece where you now have stabilized wood, which is hard as a rock, and now you have this resin, which is much softer but very brittle, just the transition between those two cuts is very challenging at times. But this is by far the most effective tool, this negative rake scraper, for doing it. Now, it's when I'm doing large bowls, and the one I'm going to show you here in the slides, I never turned off my grinder. I would sharpen this every minute, and I have 2 or 3 of them, and I would sharpen all 2 or 3, and then use them and then go sharpen them. But you have to be, it has to be sharp, because if not, you're going to start chipping it out. Other tools that are fairly effective for maybe removing larger volume. This is a Hunter Osprey, and it's hard to see that there, but it's got a carbide. It's got the Hunter carbide tip on it. But the advantage of this is that it's a bevel cut. It's not a scrape. So there are times where particularly when you're into the stabilized wood, where a bevel cut's going to give you some better controls. So the other tool from Hunter, which I don't have, but a number of people are now using, is the Hercules tool, which has a similar, you can see it has a kind of a negative rake approach to the wood. And so that is also effective. And then typically a gouge, I don't use a gouge in the conventional way because it tends to chip. If I have to remove a lot of material, I'm not really worried about the rough surface, I might, but typically I'm going to use this in a shear scraping mode, where I'm going to have it almost vertical on the tool rest, and I'm cutting just with this edge here in almost a vertical orientation. And again, it's more of a scraping motion, but it does allow me to get a little bit of bevel cut on it, a bevel support on it when I'm doing it. But to use this in the conventional gouge mode, it's going to chip out that resin. I don't find it effective at all. And the problem is that once you get chips, they're really hard. It just, you have no choice but to remove everything around it until you get to the bottom of that chip. So, so I make my final passes with the negative rake scraper. I do my final shaping, and then I go and sharpen it and make one more just feather light pass on the piece. And because what you want to do is you want to avoid sanding with high grit sandpaper. If you were to sand with 100 grit sandpaper on resin, you're going to put scratches in there that you're never going to get. I don't want to say never, but they're going to be very, very difficult to get out. So with good tool work with the negative rake scraper, I like to start at 220 because, and all I'm doing is just taking off some of the high spots if there's any ridges or anything in there, but I'm not putting a lot of scratches in there. I dry sand it to 400. And again, good. I run my dust collector the entire time I'm turning it because I want to try to capture all that, particularly with the stabilized wood. You want to get all that fine dust out right at its source. And then I switch to wet sanding, and I wet sand, and I just have a spray bottle next to the lathe, and I wet sand. I start with 600, and I go to 1,000, and then I go to 2,000 with wet sanding. And then you can buy some resin, some polishes for epoxy. What I find is that they're very similar to automotive compound, and these are much cheaper. This is turtle wax, and this is the heavy duty polishing compound, the red. And so I go that, and then you go through the polishing steps with that, and then I just use white after that, the white polishing compound. And again, this is just turtle wax polishing compound. And that's how I finish the acrylic pieces. Any questions?
All's quiet.
Is there a solvent to clean this, all your tools up and things when you're done?
Solvent that you use to clean up your tools when you're done.
Well, it's not liquid
Well,
anymore.
so if the question is, am I cleaning up like the spatulas and the mixers and the turning tools? They're not, there's nothing wet on them. So there's nothing to clean up. I mean, it's all dry. So you don't need a solvent to clean them.
No, I mean, when you're mixing things up.
I mean,
When you're mixing things up.
when you're mixing things up, no, because what I showed you how I clean the buckets, I just wait till it dries and I squeeze it. And the same thing with the rubber spatulas and stuff. On the mixer, I don't know where it went. That mixer, it's just flexible. So I clean this up. I actually just let the stuff dry on there, and then I just flex it off, and it just pops off.
Well, that's even better.
I've used this one, I don't know, a dozen times, and it's pretty clean. So, and then the molds are clean just because you use the mold release on them.
I have a question on.
All right, I'm going to run
RPM.
through.
Question on RPMs. For the people who have been turning bowls for quite a while. Okay, I started. For the people who have been turning bowls in just regular wood for quite a while, when they go to using this resin and such, do you need to lower your RPMs quite a bit, or do you do the same? What do you do?
So it is a lower RPM. You have to give the material time to cut. And so if you're using a scraper, it's going to not cut as fast as you would have with a sharp gouge on wood. So you're going to have to lower your RPM. And the other thing is, the other killer is heat, because the heat some of these things will soften the resin, and it actually gets gummy on you. So you don't want that. or the heat can actually cause it to crack if you overdo it. So yeah, Terry, it is a lower. You do have to turn a little bit slower, but there is a feel to it, and it depends on whether you're doing a bowl or a bottle opener handle. I mean, you can obviously turn this at a much higher speed, but I wouldn't turn this at the same RPM that I was just, if it was a wooden spindle that I was turning, I would turn it much slower.
Thank you.
All right, so I'm going to switch to a PowerPoint here, and I'm just going to go through the process of casting a hybrid blank that I made that some of you may have seen. So can all of you see that all right? Any problems? All right. So this is a piece of burl that was that I got from Mike Smith that had been laying outside for a while. It was very, very punky. I stabilized it first. And then I just, the top of it was kind of dark because it had been weathered. And so I coated it with epoxy resin and then just sprinkled some pearl powders, different color pearl powders on it. And then it's sitting on one of those Hdpe bases, and you can see the start of the mold being formed on there. That's the completed mold. You see I got masking tape along that bottom edge to seal it, in addition to the hot melt glue holding it on. And that's the piece placed into the pressure pot. So again, one of the advantages of using the pressure pot will hold the 5-gallon bucket. It's just a little over 12 inches. If you were to use a wider mold material, you're then sacrificing maximum diameter that you can put in the pressure pot. So that really thin Hdpe cutting board allows me to maximize the diameter that I can fit in the pot. Also, if I were to pour this outside the pot and try to put it in, first of all, there's no way to hold it, but also it would be very heavy. This blank, when it was finished, weighed 35 pounds. So that's the blank. I don't have a picture of it with the mold, but that's the blank that as it came out of the pressure pot, and I took the mold off, and you can see the pearl effect on the surface there. And this was done with epoxy. This wasn't done with the polyurethane. So this is the one that took 2 days to set. So I poured the base color, and then I just had the second color, and I just poured it very close to the surface so it didn't splash when it went in. And I buttoned it up. I wasn't sure how it was going to turn out, but it ended up with a fair amount of nice swirl with the pearlescent colors. And that's just white pearl with no dye in it in a second cup. And this was a gallon. This was a gallon of resin as I poured it. This is the bottom, and a couple things I would just want to point out here. So when I do these big pours, I just put a couple spacers underneath the block of wood, because a lot of times there's voids in the bottom as well. And if a piece is sitting down tight to the bottom, the resin often doesn't get in there. So you have to glue the spacers down to the Hdpe base, and then you have to glue the wood to the spacers, or else the wood will float up. But right in the middle of this, if you look right, I don't know whether you can see my mouse. You can. That's that little nub that I was talking about. That where the little hole in the base was, and that's my centering point for my glue block. So I always, almost 100% of the time when I'm doing a blank like this, use a glue block. I do not trust the resin to create a tenon for me to hold this. Plus, I don't want to lose that depth of creating a tenon. So this, like I said, this blank was 35 pounds, and I was going to core it, and coring puts a lot of stress on a tenon. So this is a 6-inch glue block. That's a one-way stronghold chuck. You clean the bottom with denatured alcohol. I actually turned the glue block in the jaws of the chuck, drilled an 1/8-inch hole in the center of it while on the lathe, and then without ever taking out of the chuck, glued it onto the glue block using that little nub to center it. And it allowed everything to be perfectly centered. And I just used 15-minute epoxy to epoxy it on there and let it set, let it cure for a day. It's important that you clean the bottom of that piece with denatured alcohol before you epoxy that glue block on there, though, or it will not stick. All right, and that's the piece mounted on the lathe and ready to core it. Coring was done with the one-way coring system, and I used after this I'll show you. But Hunter Tools has come out with a carbide cutter that goes. It's a diamond-shaped cutter that goes on the end of the replaces the one-way cutter, and it's great. It's really nice to use. And again, the challenge for coring this material is you're coring both resin and super hard stabilized burl. So it's again a lot of stress on the tenon. It's also a lot of stress on the coring equipment. A real nice part of this is that with the one-way system, you never have more than about an inch of that cutter extending over a support. Even when it gets a little bit warm, it gets a little sticky. It cored it very, very well. You can see, and you'll see on some later pictures, there's almost no chip out on this as we went along. I ended up doing 4 cores of it, and there they are. And another nice thing about the using the one-way system is you can use tailstock support with, you can see I have an extension on my live center that allows you to provide tailstock support, which reduces vibration, but it also keeps that if the bowl should come off, this isn't wood that's going to bounce. This is plastic that will break. It's very brittle. So if it should come out and bounce off the ways in a lathe, it's going to break. So by having that tailstock support in there, which you can do with the one-way, it really makes a big difference in your chances of success on this cut. So that's one of the blanks that came out. That's the second to the largest blank, and you can, if you look at that, it's a very, very smooth cut, considering you're cutting in and out of the burl and the resin. So because the wood was stabilized, it's airtight and the resin's airtight. So right in that picture, all it is, I used a cone center and I used that to hold it up against my vacuum chuck. And you just right here, you can see it. I just centered that manually using my tool rest, and I got it dead on because again, it's plastic. It's not moving like wood does. And it was a very clean cut coming into it. And so I got it centered, using my tool rest as a guide. And then turn on the vacuum, and you can see right here why I had to use the cone, because there was a little knob there that would have, I didn't know where the center was, so the cone just fit right over that piece. And again, this was only a ½ an inch thick. I was trying to maximize. I was trying to get 4 cores out of it. I didn't want to waste thickness. So the sides were ½ an inch, the bottom was 5/8. Again, if I had put a glue block on, or if I had, tried to put a tenon on there and hold it with a chuck, it wouldn't have worked. So I cut the outside with it on the vacuum chuck this way, and I just turned it around. I just put a minor recess on the bottom so it would sit flat on the table, and then I turned it around and used a vacuum chuck for the inside. Again, I didn't have to remove a lot of material on that, so the vacuum chuck worked great. And that's the finished set, the 4 pieces. And there's no finish on these. What you see there is it's the stabilized wood, the burl stabilized with the clear cactus juice, and then and there's no polish or anything on those pieces. That's that white turtle wax polish that came on there, and there they are opened up. It turns out the middle one really didn't have any burl in it, but I had it, so I just left it in there. It just had two little tiny pieces in there. So so that's the process to use to create one of those hybrid pieces. So the other thing you can do with any questions on that? Nope. Okay. Everybody awake? Yeah. All right. The other thing you can do is you can use the resins to repair defects. And so this is a crotch piece. It's about 18 inches in diameter and 2 inches thick. Had several checks in it that were significant. So I took this, and the one thing you need to do is you need to make sure you clean out. You need to get all the bark off that where that crotch piece is. Epoxy, none of these resins will like to stick to bark, and the bark is, even if it does adhere to it, the bark isn't adhered to the substrate very well, and you're going to end up with a problem. So you have to remove the bark, whether it's burl or a crotch or whatever you're doing. So again, that's just, and what I did to prevent bleed out or bleed in of the resin into the piece is I coated that with, I just brushed on clear epoxy into that and let it set. You could use sanding sealer. Because of the size of this, I just used epoxy, so I didn't have to use multiple coats. And then, unfortunately, I don't have a progress picture of this, but again, it's just essentially a serving tray, but I just used epoxy into that. I used the slow set epoxy. This was too big to go into a pressure pot, so I used the slower set epoxy, and I used a heat gun. As I put the epoxy in there, I just used a heat gun to get the bubbles out. What I did was I used the Hdpe, that thin Hdpe cutting board material. I just hot melted glue to the bottom of this and to the side, to this part right here. And on the top, I just put a bead of hot melt glue all around this crack, so I could build up the epoxy in there. And if it wasn't perfectly level, I didn't have to worry about it. But it just gave it a little bit more area to build it into. And then that's the back side of it. So that's just one way you can use it to repair. And you can see on the back side, there was a knot here. I poured some in here. And again, I just put hot melt glue around it to build a little dam, and then poured it in. And I did the same thing with this crack right here on it. It's again, that piece is about 18 inches in diameter. Not sure I like the color, but it is what it is. Here's another piece. There was a crack in this crack happened after I turned it, and finish turned it, and it dried, and it was already dry, but it was turned very thin just because it was a thin piece to start with. And this crack developed after it was finished. So it was only about, it was probably 3/16 of an inch thick at that point. I didn't want to lose the piece. You could have probably maybe used CA glue in here, but I used epoxy with brass powder in it. And I put it in there, and I used a heat gun to actually get it to flow down into the crack, and to make sure that this area down here, it flowed into that area as well. So it's not very thick. At its thickest point, actually, that's probably almost life size right there. It's a little less than 1/8 of an inch at the rim, and it goes down to nothing over here. And again, because this happened after, I was worried about it continuing to move. So I put a couple butterflies in there just for, they're functional and just for the effect in there. So, so that was that piece that, again, it was just a really nice piece of burl, and I didn't want to lose it. So I used it to repair that piece. This was a piece of really punky burl. All these lines in here are bug voids, or not voids, but it was sawdust from bugs getting into it. So but I ended up turning a mirror out of it. And so I stabilized this piece. When I stabilized it, all the sawdust and all those voids got firmed up. And again, that's that effect you see here, but it also had a couple of chips out of it that had come out. So I used a epoxy and brass powder in here before I turned it in order to fill in that areas here, and a couple other places on the rim. There's, you can see a little piece up there with the brass powder in there. So again, just trying to salvage a piece that otherwise would have been wasted. This is I've showed this before. This is a piece of wormy pecan that was literally, you could break this apart with your hands. I stabilized it in the vacuum chamber, and then cut it round on the lathe on the bandsaw, and then just filled in with an epoxy resin and with some pearl powder in it. All right, so things don't always go well when you use resins and epoxy, and you learn by your mistakes. This was the first nested set that I did, and I used the polyurethane resin, and this is after the repair had been made. But if you look at these 2 arrows here, there's actually a crack in this bowl. When I took it out of the pressure pot, it was probably a little over an eighth, maybe probably almost 3/16 at its widest point, and it extended from the rim all the way down into the middle of the bowl. And it was a thermal crack. Again, it had gotten too hot, and as it cooled, the plastic shrank. And fortunately, it was just one crack. And so I filled it with a resin that didn't quite match, and you can see it right there is where on the finished product where it was. But fortunately, because this had a kind of a variegated appearance to it, the crack really wasn't all that obvious, because it kind of blended in with the other pieces. But it was in 3 of the 4 cores that were in this bowl. So again, but that was a lesson learned, not to use that resin for a pour that's that deep. You really need to go with a resin that's meant for a much slower set than that. This was I mentioned a sphere that I turned that it was either a thermal problem, or I'm thinking I didn't mix it well enough, but it was cloudy. So this piece actually sat on my bench for almost 2 years after I turned it, not knowing what to do with it. And a number of people said, "Wow, that's really cool." It's because you can't see it in the picture, but it's kind of a cloudy. It's not really cloudy. It's kind of a ripple effect. It almost looks like wavy water in there. And so I just made it part of the piece. After sitting on my bench for almost 2 years, I decided to see if anybody wanted to buy it. So, but that is again, that's after I did this piece. I bought the power mixer for my larger pours, and I haven't had any similar problems on that since. Here's another problem on a bowl that I was doing when I was doing some of my router work. Right up in here, you see this arrow there's when I poured, I cut these grooves, and on the parts of this where this was end grain, on the inside of these grooves, the resin bled into the parent wood, and you can see it here and on this side here. And this is actually maple. It wasn't this dark, and so I rather than I attempted to stain the wood darker in order to try to mask that, and the whole thing turned out very ugly. So this is in the reject pile. But there's a real danger when you do stuff like this. If you're dealing with end grain, that resin will bleed, whether you use pressure or not. Resin will bleed into the end grain. And on this particular bowl, if you could see the side grain, it didn't. Where you have some of the side grain, you don't see that that same effect, but wherever there was end grain, it just went right into it, and it was so blotchy, particularly on before I stained that maple. So the remedy for that is to here's a different cherry bowl, but the same effect, ribbing effect in it. And on this one, I used 2 coats of sanding sealer on the inside edges of all those grooves before I cast the resin in it, and didn't end up with any bleed into that at all. So so lesson learned there. Any questions on any of those? All right. And finally, we'll just wrap this up here. I would just like to just show a couple of, photographing pieces with resin that are usually very highly polished is very difficult. It's not difficult, it's challenging, it requires some. And so I spent some time with John Vaith, just playing with different things to different ideas on how to photograph it, because you can really get some pretty dramatic effects. And John is far better at it than I am. I don't know, is John on? I don't know whether he's here tonight. So some of the challenges are it's difficult to reduce glare or to eliminate glare on polished resin because it's like glass. You can try varying your light angle. You can use a reflector. You can use a diffuser. But sometimes you just have to accept the fact you're going to get some glare on your piece because it is highly polished. Backlighting can be used to enhance the pearl or the translucent effects of it very effectively. And the key is to try all sorts of different multiple lighting setups. And I'm just going to show you a couple examples of some of the things that John did on a couple of pieces that highlights the different things you can do. So here's a piece that it's 4 pieces of burl with resin cast around it, and this is done with the polyurethane resin, and this is just the pearl color just poured into it right just before it's set, at 95 degrees. So you can see in there's very good separation between the pearl and the base color on there. So that's one effect. There it is, just a little bit lighter, a little bit more light coming through the back. John put a diffuser on this and actually shot the light through the piece to get the effect on the back. Very interesting shadow coming through on the back. And then again, a similar effect that with just a different lighting situation. So here, what's interesting here is now you see the effect of the pearl really on the front of the piece. It really highlights the reflection of the pearl powder right on the surface of the piece. Whereas some of it, when you backlight it, sometimes it shows it with its depth. So very different effect as to where you put the light and where your shadows are. And but very artistic. John was very artistic in achieving different effects with that. And so I guess the point of showing this is to just play with different things and different lighting effects if you're using, particularly if you're using the pearlescent powders. And then finally, here's just another piece and shot one way without, you can see some of the effect, but there again, with just bringing some light through the back of it, it just tends to highlight the pearl powder even more. So, and that's my presentation. Any questions? Come on. Anybody awake?
Yes,
All right.
Steve, I have a question.
Well, there's a question.
Can you hear me? Yeah. So, Steve, you've shown us 3 processes for stabilization. And as you saw from my punky cypress resin screwdrivers that I turned last month, I didn't use any of these best practices. So my question is, when do I need to use them? You showed us Cactus Juice and vacuum withdrawal to stabilize the wood. Well, if I've got a solid wood, do I really need it? And then there was the oven drying. If I've got my wood stabilized, kiln dried to 6 or 8%, do I really need to go to oven drying? And the last is the pressure pot with the resin. I understand that, you know, that drives the air out and the bubbles, but you know, I've been able to do that painfully by just, you know, pouring resin into the voids and let it dry and pour the resin into the voids and repeat that 5 times without buying a pressure pot or the compressor that goes through it. So, I mean, if I don't have punky wood, do I need all 3 of those processes if I have stable wood?
So it depends on, it depends. If you're doing larger pieces, even with and the opinion on whether you need to stabilize the wood or not it's entirely up to you. I've seen a number of people that don't do it. I've also seen in my own work that pieces that I did not stabilize and poured resin against them, that after finishing and when they were exposed to a different humidity, you ended up with a bump between, because the wood swells and the resin doesn't. So you end up at that interface. If you run your hand over it, you can feel the jump in the piece. So those big bowls that have that nested set of bowls had $200 worth of materials in it, between the resin and the stabilizing juice in the burl itself. So am I going to do everything I can do to make sure that that doesn't come apart and that stays together and gives me the best chance of success? Yeah, I'm going to do that. But my bottle opener handles, do I need to do it? Probably not. I just do it as a matter of course, because I will tell you that if you're using polyurethane resin, the rapid setting resin, if you do not do it under pressure, you will get air bubbles in it. There's no way to avoid it. It just sets too fast. If you're using epoxy resin that sets slow and you can put a heat gun on it or a torch, that will help you get the air bubbles out. And if it's a thin pour, you're probably fine. If that platter that I repaired, that the crotch platter that had the big purple patch in it, that wasn't stabilized and it wasn't cast under pressure. So yeah, you can do it. And there's no air bubbles in it because I took the time. I used a very slow setting epoxy and used a heat gun as I put it in there to get the bubbles out. So it depends on what you're doing and what you want to achieve with your final result, whether it's an art piece or a functional piece, or and again, how big it is, I think is probably it. As far as it being oven dry, I think that's very important. And if you, with the humidity around here, I'd be surprised if very much wood is at 6%. It may be 6% at the surface, but that's a very low moisture content. So if it's truly 6%, you're probably okay with epoxy. But if you're using polyurethane resin, even the surface humidity on that wood is going to cause that polyurethane resin to foam or to maybe foam. So that answer your question?
I'm sorry, Greg, I muted you because I was hearing background noise, so I muted everyone.
So Greg,
You're
did
muted,
that answer your
Greg. You're
question?
muted.
Yes,
Stop.
Steve?
Stop talking,
Yeah.
Greg. You're muted. You have to unmute first. You need to unmute.
Okay, yes, Steve, thank you. That answered my question, and I'm going to go out and look for a cheap used toaster oven.
Yeah. Well,
That's
yeah,
it.
the
Thanks.
Well, that's
Thrift
only
stores
for
are
the
a good place to look.
stabilizing, not for the pouring. Not for the casting.
No, even if you're using polyurethane resin, you should oven dry your work before you cast it.
Okay.
I'm pretty much always using epoxy resin, either deep pour or for 3/8 of an inch, regular surface pour. So
Right. The moisture is not as much of an issue for epoxy as it is for the polyurethane. So you have a lot. If you're air dried at 6% or something, you're probably okay with epoxy. Polyurethane, not so much.
okay, thank you.
Steve,
If you're familiar with Gorilla Glue is a polyurethane glue that sets with, actually, in order to set it, you use moisture. You put moisture on one surface and you put the two pieces together and it foams up. That's the glue. That's that polyurethane glue reacting with the moisture on the pieces that causes that foam. So the polyurethane resin is just a subset of that. Any other questions?
yeah, Steve, Mike Bulette, have you ever had a piece separate while turning?
I have not. And I
Okay,
think part of that is probably just due to the preparation and the care. I shouldn't say that. I think maybe one of the first bottle opener handles I did where I didn't get all the bark off. That may have had a problem with that, and it didn't come off while turning. I think it just cracked. It might even crack coming out of the mold, but I haven't had any of the big hybrid bowls or anything like that crack. And I think a lot of that is just due to the stabilization process.
okay, thank you.
I'd like to make a comment, potential clarification. You mentioned using a heat gun to get rid of the bubbles. My belief and experience is that a heat gun, actually I used a little butane torch in my shop to get rid of bubbles. It only gets rid of the bubbles that have risen to the surface, and it pops them very effectively. But I don't think you should set an expectation that it'll get rid of any bubbles that have not yet reached the surface.
Well, it'll bring them to the surface if they're visible.
I don't think they bring it to the surface.
I've done it. That's literally what it does. I'm not saying that. I mean, so let's say the pour is an inch deep. You see a bubble on the bottom. If you sit there with a heat gun, it will rise to the top and pop. Now, you're right. If it's embedded in the wood, it isn't going to do a darn thing. If you can't see the bubble, it's not going to bring it up.
No. I don't mean things embedded in wood. It's just been my experience that it only works for me, and I haven't done any really thick pours, but it only works on the stuff that's at the surface. Okay, your experience is different. Thank you.
So you're
Alan,
basically just picking up the resin and making it thinner so that it actually lets the bubbles release easier.
Right.
If you look at the guys doing the resin pours, the river tables, they are either using a torch or a heat gun on a 2-inch pour to get the bubbles out. So again, that's just my experience that it's very effective doing it.
I have an amateur pro tip too. So if you're anything like me, sooner or later, you're going to have a resin disaster in trying to set one of these up if you're not using a pressure part in particular. For $10, you can go to Home Depot and pick up a water tank drain pan. And it gives you a nice 2-inch high, 24 to 26-inch tray. And I do all of my finishing and resin work inside that tray so that if I have any kind of a disaster, it's limited. But I'm spill prone, so.
I'll give you another tip. So it's really hard to estimate volumes as you're preparing your, so if you keep some cups handy, And you take whatever's extra. If you have extra resin, you don't want to run short when you're doing a pour. But if you do have some extra, you can just pour it into various molds or cups. And these will make, these are for bottle stoppers for lids on boxes. But yeah, just I have a collection of these things that I can use for various little things. That sometimes it's just if you're trying to match a color later on, even they're helpful. But yeah, it's helpful to just not waste anything. And you know, that'll make a wine bottle stopper, that little piece there. So any other thoughts, questions? All right. So we would like some feedback. It doesn't have to be right now, but if anybody has any thoughts, again, this is the first time we're using this equipment. So quality of the sound, quality of the pictures, you know, what we're doing here, because this hopefully will be how we transition this over to when we go back to our live meetings and broadcast our meetings on Zoom at the same time. So, and with that, I think we're done. We will hopefully see you all on Tuesday night or next Thursday night for our show and tell. And we'll talk about some boxes. And thank you everybody for attending. We'll see you next week.